In this video, I would like to tell a little bit about myself and my story. I will tell without preparation, plot, and editing, but just my thoughts as I remember. I hope this story will resonate with someone and help them in some way. I come from an ordinary family. My mom worked as a salesman, my dad worked as a plumber, and it so happened that my parents divorced, and about 7 or 8 years old I started to live with my grandmother. I would like to add that my parents divorced because there were misunderstandings, disagreements, and bad habits. Just like any average family. That's when I was not happy that I will live with my grandmother and opposed it. But then I accepted that people break up and sometimes they do not fit each other and it is better to let go. I lived with my grandmother and my grandfather, and my grandmother's son, my uncle, lived with me. My mom lived in a separate apartment. My dad was on his second marriage. Then I was transferred from one school to another to be closer to home near my grandmother. I resented my mom, and I didn't speak to her for 2 years at all, since she initiated the whole thing. She would text me, like good night, but I didn't respond. It was a difficult time for her and for me, because I lived where I was not welcome, where I was not loved, as I thought at the time. My grandmother raised me to be kind, honest, decent, and punctual. I had to get home at 8:00 p.m., when others were still out walking. So I also lived on the other side of town and had to take the bus half an hour before deadline. So we lived as a foursome: me, my grandmother, my grandfather, and my uncle. I'll tell you a little bit about my uncle. He was about 30 years old. He happened to get mixed up with a bad crowd, drug addicts, and all that. It was the year 2000. And before my parents got divorced, my grandmother lived in another town with my grandfather. And it turns out my mom and dad lived in one apartment, which my grandfather got. He was a military man. And my uncle lived in the other apartment. And my uncle and his friends, although it was hard to call them friends, but maybe for him they were, he used all these illegal substances with them and was docile. The bad company affected him negatively in the sense that he got some head injuries and became incapacitated. In general, he was thinking normally, but he started to hallucinate and had various visions, both in dreams and in reality. I remember I was walking from school, and on this day, I was late with my friends and went to play hide-and-seek in the street. Here we played hide-and-seek and I am coming home, and before entering the apartment, I felt something as if my soul was flying out of the apartment. I went in, turned around, and my eyes immediately fell on the corridor. There was a bar, and my uncle was hanging on it. He hanged himself, and I saw it first. My grandparents were at work, and I was not confused and immediately realized that I should try to take it down, but I was small. I weighed about 30 kilograms. It was hanging on a little cable, like an internet cable, or like a cell phone charger wire. His neck was squeezed almost in half. His face was black and blue. I was afraid that if I went into that narrow hallway, I'd start shaking or something. Anyway, something stopped me, and I went straight to the entryway and started calling my grandmother. She was working and didn't answer. I called my grandfather. He was a security guard in the military. I called him and said, "My uncle is in a bad situation and I need to come over." I didn't tell him right away what had happened because he was his son and I understood what kind of reaction he would have. I was pretty understanding at the time. I don't know. I don't think anyone could have navigated that situation. He arrived and I told him at the entrance to the apartment that this was the situation, and he flew in and took him off the bar. It was really sad. It was the first time I saw my grandfather cry. My grandmother came over, so there was mourning for a long time. I didn't really understand it at the time, and my uncle wasn't really a key person in my life. It was the first death before my eyes, and that's when I realized that people die. It's been a while. Time dulls the pain, as we all know, or maybe some of us don't. And we started living like this now, the three of us. Some time passes. I graduate high school. That's when I started getting serious. I was also deciding where to go to college. I didn't really think about sharing my feelings with my loved ones. I was brought up to be a man, don't cry, you have to be strong, and something like that. And I live with that thought, but I try to change it in every possible way. That's because to be strong is to be weak at some point, and a lot of people don't realize that. So we went on with our lives. I moved to another city and went to a financial university and am now in my 4th year. My girlfriend and I have been dating long distance. It was difficult in some places that there were no relatives around. But I had a friend and we helped each other. In the 2nd year we had an internship, and before it was such a disaster that my mom got sick. My mom worked as a store clerk and they had this bag on her belt. And she had a mole on this spot. And a lot of people know that moles, if exposed, can turn into malignant tumors. I was texting with her. She says my mole started growing something. I went to the doctor and they cut it out. And that's it. I think it's fine. I mean, it's not like there's a problem. At some point, she started growing where the mole was. They only took out the top part, and I guess they had to take out the root of the problem. It was the 21st year. It was the time of the coronavirus. And in order to take some tests and cut out the main part, she had to take a coronavirus test. My family doesn't like to go to hospitals, and my mom was putting it off, and when she found out that there was a serious problem, I pressed her to go to the doctor. She went to the doctor, and a tumor was found. The tumor was cut out, and she had to undergo chemotherapy. Well, it turned out that my mom was postponing this process, and it so happened that there was an open day in the cancer center, and people were accepted there for free. But we came almost at the very last moment, and there were already closed places, but my grandmother was able to negotiate. And to make sure you understand, my grandmother never told anyone what kind of cancer my mom had. She said that everything was normal. We visited Mom almost every day. She had a period when she went out to smoke and breathe fresh air. This is a normal practice for such centers. So we went to visit her, and nothing seemed to go wrong. She was discharged, and that was it. I went back to the city where I finished my studies and came back in the summer when my studies were over. My mother went for examination, was checked, and they found another tumor on the inner part of the thigh of the left leg and said that it was necessary to cut it out. She had surgery, and then found out it was malignant and had to undergo another round of chemotherapy. The first chemo was a success. The second was harder, and nothing seemed to be going wrong. At some point, my grandmother calls me and tells me that Mom had a third chemo. She says, "Mom's a little sick in there. You come home and stay with her." Mom's been living on her own. So she comes home and she's really sick, she's nauseous, she won't eat. Then everything's kind of normal. I'm sleeping in the same bed as her, and I wake up and I don't remember exactly what it was like, but I remember she started having some kind of seizures. Something was destroying her inside, and at some point she stopped walking, talking, and taking in any information. She became a vegetable and couldn't do anything. She would just lie there and make basic sounds. I was very scared, and this situation really got to me, and I couldn't stay at home. I slept at the girl's house all the time. The next morning I spent some time with my mom. I don't know what to do. It was probably the chemo that made her sick. My mom couldn't sleep. I figured she was afraid she was going to die, and she had been awake all this time for a week. She was constantly making noises. Grandma and Grandpa took turns sleeping next to Mom. On the 8th day, Grandma decided to call a priest because she is a believer. The priest read the confession and said something. I don't know much about it. And the next day, or the same evening, my mom started talking a little bit. She started walking, and she started recovering. I thought everything was going to be okay now. I was helping her learn to walk and talk again. And everything seemed to be getting better. But then came the next chemo, the 4th chemo. And I had to get another coronavirus test and x-rays, and then the next chemo. My mom could hardly walk. My grandmother accompanied her, and I helped too, but it was hard for me to be around her. I didn't tell anyone that my mom was sick because I didn't want to live it again and hear support that I didn't need at that moment. I went out with friends, slept over at a girl's house, and everything would have been fine, but there was this situation, and my mom had chemo and she got sick again. It's all back to the way it was. and at some point I decided to sleep over, as I realized that my mom could be worse at any moment, and it was worth it to be there for her. I wouldn't wish what I went through at that moment on anyone. I had a lot of faith that my mom would heal and everything would be fine. I didn't know that at some point any phrase could be the last thing she would hear. I heard my mom constantly waking up my grandmother and saying, "I'm afraid to go to sleep. I don't want to die." I was sleeping, and at some point my grandfather woke me up and told me to call an ambulance. I remember that the ambulance comes. My grandfather runs up to me and says that my mom is sick. Anyway, she started having seizures, and seizures are a bad precursor. It's an indication that calcium is coming out of the bones, as my doctor friend told me. It was really hard to watch my mom shake really badly. It wasn't easy. Maybe someone has caught epileptics shaking, only this was several times worse. The next day, I went for a walk to distract myself, as I was having a really hard time. I'm walking in the park, and my grandfather calls me and tells me that my mom is basically gone. She died a few hours later. I'm standing there, and as if there was a strange sensation, as if the weight of the body was zeroed out, and you just stand there, weightless. You don't know what's going on. You're kind of in reality or not. So it was really hard on all of us. For my grandparents, it was their, I think, favorite and last child, and it was my mom. I don't know. It was a very hard time. I remember riding the bus when my mom was sick, looking at the droplets running down the window and listening to sad music and crying on the bus. I forgot to tell you that my grandmother on my dad's side of the family, also a close person to me, died before my mom died. My grandmother had 70% lung damage. She was lying there dying. Even when we buried her, the coffin was closed, and they said that she died of suffocation and it was better not to look at such a thing. She was dying terribly. But my mom's death shook me more than anything. I quarreled with my classmates, and quarreled with a classmate with whom I was close friends. Some time passed, and it became a little easier, but I began to see the world through a prism of black. Everything was gray to me. I didn't want to talk to anyone or do anything. The meaning of life was gone. I just didn't know what to do, so I was alone. I didn't have bad thoughts about my life, and I'm not a person who gives up. It was hard, of course, but at some point I got acquainted with philosophy and I learned a lot of interesting and necessary information for me. I had to tell my story first of all for the sake of myself, to make it easier to talk about it, because I remember this time hard, and then my grandfather had a hard time with the death of his daughter's mother. I remember a few weeks passed. One day my grandfather went to the balcony to smoke, and at some point my grandmother screamed very hard, ran into the room, called me, and I see that he fell on the balcony. Grandma's shaking him, doesn't know what's going on. I realize that his heart has probably stopped, and I pull him to the kitchen through the balcony on a flat surface and start CPR. For 30 minutes, while the ambulance was on its way, I gave my grandfather CPR and heart massage. I didn't know it wouldn't help him. I just did the best I could. The doctor came in, hooked up some kind of thing, like a pacemaker or something. The doctor said he had a blood clot and there was nothing he could do. It was awful. My grandmother was alone and I was with her. I supported her in every way I could. It was a hard time, she cried, every day. She had no one left but me. She lost her husband's 2 children and I was the only one left. In general, it was very hard to accept the fact that my mother died in the summer and my grandfather in the fall, 20 days before my birthday. He was a very important person to me. He's the simplest man who would never lie. He is sincere, kind, and every member of my family taught me something useful, put me something useful. Let me give you one example. I have 2 cats at home, or rather at my grandmother's house where we lived. My grandmother used to feed them in the evening, and when my grandfather came home from work, he would look at what they were asking him to eat and whisper and say, "Let me feed you while my grandmother is not seeing." I would look at it and always wondered how kind and loving he was. He loved Grandma and the cats very much. All in all, it was another tough loss for me. I always thought it was some kind of punishment for me for something. I honestly didn't do anything bad in my life. I didn't steal. I didn't cheat. I might have embellished a story to make my friends laugh, that's all. I just thought it was some kind of punishment, but then life confronted me with another situation. One night, I went to a computer club at night, and it just so happens that my father's wife from my second marriage calls me. She tells me that your dad's gone and disappeared. I didn't realize what it was, because that didn't usually happen, but my dad was the kind of person who would go out drinking at a club and so on. I thought it was just his phone running out of power. I got home from the computer club at 7 a.m. and went to bed. My stepmother calls me and tells me that my dad hanged himself. I'm just shocked. It's not like it was a bad thing. My dad was involved with gangsters. Anyway, I didn't know what the reason was. As I found out later, he did it because those gangsters forced him to. And just so you understand, Dad was the strongest person in the world for me, and my grandmother who survived many deaths, and after all, she doesn't drink or smoke. She walks 20 kilometers every day. She never gave up once. She's raising me, helping me. Now I am 22 years old. I have no parents. I am an orphan. I receive survivor's allowance, and this money does not replace my parents in any way, and I want to convey to you in every possible way that you should appreciate your loved ones, appreciate the time you spend with them. I thought they weren't going anywhere, but when you realize it, it's too late. My classmate's mom was killed in a car accident. It was awful, but he still had his dad. One day he asked me this question: how do you live with yourself after everything that's happened to you? I would like you to realize from my sad experience that it is important to tell your parents, other relatives, uncles, aunts, and so on, that you love them and that you are there for them. After all, at some point it may be too late. Some people talk about how their problems stop them and somehow they can't move on. I am in no way judging their perceptions and reactions to the outside world, but what I have experienced, I would not want to advise anyone to experience. Because when all your loved ones are taken away from you over the course of a few years, and you are left with one grandmother, thank goodness she wasn't taken away. It's just really hard not to start using any antidepressants. I don't use them if anything. I don't drink alcohol or smoke. In general, I tried to cut myself off from reality and go to that world where I can realize myself without those problems that were in real life. But they do not go anywhere. They remain here, and I live with this burden to this day. Here I wanted to say, if you have parents, relatives, arms, legs, clear mind and reason, you have all the opportunities to conquer this world, both in career and to build a family or whatever your goals are, to leave something behind so that when you die, people can enjoy what you have done. I was really stumped by this, and I can't say that my experience is pretty easy. Every death has taken me back 2 steps and made me realize that life in general is a terrible place where you can't give slack.